Debt is a strange thing, Ethan Walker once heard an old cargo pilot say, because the universe doesn't care whether you can pay it back. The words echoed in his mind as he stood beneath the towering arches of the Meridian Interstellar Exchange, a market station hanging in silent orbit above a rust-colored desert world nearly 40,000 miles from the nearest human colony. The air smelled faintly of heated metal and recycled oxygen, the scent every spacer eventually learned to associate with trouble. Ethan's boots rested on polished alloy flooring that reflected the bright market lights overhead, and for a moment he could see his own reflection staring back at him, tall, broad-shouldered, sandy blonde hair a little too long from months in transit, blue eyes tired from too many sleepless cargo runs across unfamiliar sectors. None of that mattered now. Behind him, dock technicians were already towing away the battered freighter that had been his livelihood for the past 6 years. The ship wasn't much to look at, 200 feet of patched hull plating and stubborn engines that rattled like loose tools in a metal drawer, but it had been his ticket to freedom. Now it belonged to someone else. A tall alien merchant stood across the trading floor studying a glowing ledger suspended in the air between them. Karen Vesh was impossible to ignore. Nearly 8 feet tall, draped in layered robes of deep emerald fabric that shimmered under the station lights, his skin carried a faint green hue like polished jade. Four slender fingers tapped calmly across the floating interface as lines of crimson numbers flickered to life. Ethan didn't understand half the symbols, but he understood the total. Even after converting alien currency into Earth credits, the figure would have been enough to buy a house in Texas, a fishing boat in Florida, and maybe a small ranch somewhere quiet. Instead, it represented the damage from a single navigation error, one drifting cargo container that had clipped the merchant's shipment while docking. No explosions. No dramatic alarms. Just one quiet impact that turned his life sideways. Karen finally lowered the ledger and looked at him with slow, measured patience, the kind of patience only someone very wealthy could afford. Around them the trading hall continued buzzing with alien voices and mechanical carts gliding along silent rails, but the space between them felt strangely still. Ethan cleared his throat and forced his voice to stay steady. "Look, I didn't mean to damage your shipment," he said. "I'll work it off. Freight runs, repairs, whatever you need." The merchant tilted his head slightly, as if considering an interesting puzzle rather than a desperate man. "Human labor," Karen replied in smooth, accented English, "would require approximately 27 Earth years to repay this debt." Ethan blinked once. 27 years. He was 32. By the time he finished paying that back, his whole life would be gone. The station lights hummed softly above them. Somewhere far below the observation windows, the desert planet turned slowly in the dark. Karen studied Ethan for another moment before speaking again, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. "However, there is another form of payment." Ethan frowned. "I don't have anything else." The merchant's thin lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "On the contrary, Mr. Walker. You possess something very rare in this sector." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What's that?" Karen lifted one long finger and gestured toward the corridor behind him. The crowd shifted. And from the far side of the trading hall, a tall figure began walking toward them with measured, graceful steps. Her skin shimmered the color of deep ocean glass beneath the white station lights. Silver hair fell over her shoulders like liquid metal. And her calm, unreadable eyes settled directly on Ethan Walker as Karen spoke the words that would change his life. "My daughter requires a husband." For several long seconds Ethan Walker did not move. The trading hall around him continued its restless motion, alien merchants negotiating shipments, cargo drones gliding silently across the polished floor, distant announcements echoing through hidden speakers in a dozen different languages. But Ethan heard none of it. His attention stayed locked on the figure approaching through the crowd. She moved with a calm confidence that seemed to bend the busy corridor around her. Taller than Ethan by several inches, her skin carried the smooth blue-green tone of polished sea glass under bright sunlight. The station lights reflected softly along her cheekbones and the elegant curve of her neck. Long strands of silver hair drifted behind her shoulders with every step, catching the glow of passing holocines. Ethan had seen dozens of alien species during his freight runs across the outer trade routes, but something about her presence made the massive hull feel suddenly quiet. Not intimidating. Not threatening. Just, undeniable. She stopped exactly 6 feet away from him and folded her slender hands behind her back. Her eyes were a pale shade of violet that seemed almost luminous beneath the white lights of the exchange ceiling. Those eyes studied Ethan carefully, moving from his worn boots to the grease stain on his sleeve and finally to his face. There was no cruelty in her gaze, but there was something else. Distance. The kind of distance someone develops after spending a lifetime surrounded by rules that other people create for them. Karen Vesh gestured toward her with quiet pride. "This is my daughter, Lyra Vesh." Ethan swallowed once before nodding politely. "Ma'am." Lyra did not immediately respond. She looked at him the way a scientist might examine a rare mineral sample, curious but cautious. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, every word perfectly measured. "You are the human pilot who damaged our cargo shipment." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "That would be me." She tilted her head slightly, silver hair shifting across her shoulder. "You appear smaller than I expected." Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh. "I get that sometimes." Karen lifted a hand, interrupting the moment before it could grow any more awkward. A new contract window unfolded in the air between them, glowing lines of alien script translating slowly into English as the system recognized Ethan's neural tag. The numbers were still there. The debt had not magically disappeared. 27 years of labor, reduced to a single alternative clause that pulsed gently in amber light. Marriage contract authorization. Ethan stared at it, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. "You are serious about this," he said slowly. Karen's expression remained perfectly calm. "My daughter requires a human husband for a particular diplomatic arrangement with several outer trade partners. Your species is considered trustworthy." Ethan blinked. "You are telling me I wreck one cargo container and suddenly I am qualified for interstellar diplomacy?" Lyra spoke before her father could answer. "It is not about diplomacy," she said quietly. "It is about symbolism." Ethan looked back at her. "Symbolism?" She nodded once. "Humans are known for loyalty. Resilience. Emotional commitment to partnerships." There was a faint pause before she added, "Those qualities are useful in long-term trade alliances." Ethan stared at the glowing contract again. His freighter was gone. His savings were gone. The nearest human colony was more than 400 light-years away and he did not have enough credits left to buy a shuttle ticket. The numbers floating in the air did not care about any of that. Lyra watched him silently for several seconds before speaking again. "If it eases your concern," she said gently, "I did not choose this arrangement either." That sentence landed heavier than anything her father had said. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the contract and met her gaze again. For the first time since she arrived, the distance in her expression softened just a little. Not pity. Not sympathy. Something closer to recognition. Two strangers standing under bright station lights, both caught in a deal neither of them had planned. And somewhere deep inside Ethan Walker's chest, the old pilot's words echoed again. Debt is a strange thing. Because the universe does not care whether you can pay it back. The contract remained suspended in the air between them, its amber light reflecting across the polished floor like a quiet warning. Ethan Walker stared at the glowing lines of translation as if they might rearrange themselves into something less permanent if he waited long enough. They did not. Marriage authorization. Debt settlement clause. Transfer of financial liability. The words looked strangely clean for something that felt so heavy. Around them the trading hall continued its endless rhythm of movement and negotiation, but Ethan felt as if the entire station had stepped back to watch his answer. Karen Vesh folded his long hands behind his back with the relaxed posture of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome. His emerald robes shimmered slightly as cargo lights passed overhead. "You may take time to consider," the merchant said calmly, though his tone suggested the decision had already been made. Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed his palms together. "How much time?" Karen's expression did not change. 5 minutes. Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh again. 5 minutes to decide the rest of his life. That felt about right for the kind of luck he had been having lately. He looked toward Lyra Vesh again. She had not moved since the contract appeared. Her posture remained straight, composed, hands folded loosely behind her back as if she were attending a formal ceremony rather than standing beside a stranger who might become her husband in the next few minutes. Yet her eyes were different now. The cool distance had softened into something more thoughtful. Curious, perhaps. Ethan shifted his weight and spoke quietly so that only she could hear. "Let me ask you something." She tilted her head slightly. "You may ask." "If I say no," Ethan said, glancing briefly at the floating debt total, "what happens to me?" Lyra did not hesitate. "My father will assign you to a labor contract within his commercial fleet." Ethan nodded slowly. 27 years. Approximately. "And if I say yes?" She glanced briefly at the glowing contract before meeting his eyes again. "The debt is erased immediately." Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for some hidden catch behind the calm tone. "Just like that?" Lyra nodded once. "Just like that." He ran a hand through his sandy blonde hair and looked toward the high observation windows at the far end of the hall. Through the transparent panels the desert planet below rotated slowly, its copper-colored surface glowing beneath distant sunlight. Somewhere down there people were living ordinary lives. Eating dinner. Driving trucks. Arguing about sports teams and weather forecasts. Meanwhile he was standing on a space station deciding whether to marry someone he had met less than 10 minutes ago. "You said earlier that you did not choose this either," Ethan said. Lyra's silver hair shifted slightly as she inclined her head. "That is correct." "Then why agree to it?" For the first time since she arrived, something almost like honesty appeared in her expression. Not sadness. Not anger. Just a quiet understanding that some doors never open. "Because refusing would create greater problems than accepting," she answered softly. Ethan considered that for a moment. The answer felt strangely familiar. Every cargo pilot understood that logic. Sometimes you took the job that paid the bills, even if it meant flying through meteor dust or docking at stations where the gravity regulators hummed like angry refrigerators. Life rarely offered perfect choices. Just manageable ones. Karen's calm voice drifted back toward them. 2 minutes remain. Ethan let out a slow breath and looked once more at the glowing contract floating between them. 27 years of labor. Or one impossible marriage. He turned back toward Lyra Vesh. "You know. Something funny," he said quietly. She raised one pale eyebrow. "What is funny?" Ethan gave a small shrug. "Back on Earth, most people spend years trying to find someone to marry." He gestured toward the contract. "I guess I found the express version." Lyra studied him for a long second before something subtle changed in her eyes. Not amusement exactly. But perhaps the beginning of understanding. 1 minute, Karen Vesh said calmly, his voice carrying across the polished floor like the quiet tick of a clock. The glowing contract continued hovering in the air between them, its amber light steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the universe. Ethan Walker looked at it for another long second, then slowly lifted his hand. His fingers hovered above the authorization symbol, and he felt the strange weight of the moment settle into his chest. 27 years of labor. Or one impossible marriage to a woman he had met less than 10 minutes ago. Somewhere deep in his mind, the answer felt obvious. Not easy. But obvious. He let out a slow breath. Well, Ethan said quietly, mostly to himself, this is definitely not how I thought today was going to go. Then he pressed his palm against the glowing signature field. The contract reacted instantly. The amber light shifted to bright blue as the station system scanned his genetic markers and confirmed his identity. Lines of alien script flickered across the display faster now, translating automatically into English as the agreement finalized. Debt liability transferred. Labor sentence nullified. Marriage contract authenticated. A soft chime echoed through the air like the closing note of a quiet bell. Ethan lowered his hand and stared at the now completed document. Just like that, 27 years of debt had vanished. Karen Vesh nodded with clear satisfaction and waved one elegant hand. The contract dissolved into a cloud of fading light. Efficient, the merchant said calmly. I appreciate efficient decisions. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again. Yeah. That makes one of us. Karen ignored the remark and turned slightly toward his daughter. Preparations will begin immediately, he said. The ceremony will take place within the hour. Ethan blinked. Within the hour? The merchant gave him a mildly puzzled look. Is that not customary among humans? Ethan laughed once under his breath. Not where I come from. Lyra Vesh had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, watching the contract finalize with the same composed expression she had worn since entering the hall. But now she stepped forward slightly, closing the distance between them by another foot. Up close, Ethan noticed details he had missed before. The faint shimmer along the surface of her blue-green skin. The delicate patterns near her temples that caught the light like fine glass. And those pale violet eyes, steady and thoughtful as they studied him again. You signed very quickly, she said softly. Ethan shrugged. I did the math. You sacrificed your freedom for convenience. He tilted his head slightly. I think you and I might define freedom differently right now. That answer seemed to interest her. She considered it for a moment before nodding once. Perhaps. Across the hall, station workers were already clearing a section of the trading floor. Portable ceremonial pillars unfolded from the floor panels with mechanical precision, rising nearly 8 feet tall as glowing symbols appeared across their surfaces. A small crowd of curious merchants and travelers began gathering at a respectful distance, whispering quietly as they realized a formal union was about to take place in the middle of the exchange hall. Ethan stared at the rapidly forming ceremony area with disbelief. You have got to be kidding me, he muttered. Lyra followed his gaze. My father values efficiency in all agreements. Apparently. He watched a hovering drone glide past carrying what looked suspiciously like ceremonial rings sealed inside a glass container. Back on Earth, Ethan said slowly, people usually have time to call their families before getting married. Lyra looked at him again, something thoughtful flickering across her expression. Would you prefer to delay the ceremony? Ethan considered the question seriously for a moment. The freighter was gone. The debt was gone. The choice had already been made. Finally he gave a small shrug. At this point, he said, I guess we might as well see this thing through. For the first time since meeting him, the faintest hint of a smile touched the corner of Lyra Vesh's lips. The ceremonial pillars finished rising from the station floor with a quiet mechanical hum, their smooth surfaces glowing with shifting patterns of alien symbols that Ethan Walker could not read but somehow understood were ancient. The trading hall had changed in only a few minutes. What had once been a busy marketplace filled with bargaining voices and cargo traffic now carried a different atmosphere, quieter but filled with curiosity. Merchants, travelers, and station workers stood in a wide circle around the newly formed ceremonial space, watching with the cautious fascination people reserved for unusual events. Carried clearly through hidden audio amplifiers around the platform. By the authority of the Meridian Interstellar Exchange and under the commercial law of 7 recognized trade systems, this union is acknowledged as a binding alliance between 2 individuals and their respective houses. Ethan leaned slightly toward Lyra and whispered, 7 systems sounds like a lot of paperwork. Lyra's eyes flickered with what might have been the smallest hint of amusement. The official raised a slender device that projected 2 small rings of soft white light into the air between them. Inside each ring floated a simple band of polished metal. Symbols of partnership, the official continued. A reminder that agreements built on trust endure longer than those built only on profit. Ethan reached forward carefully and lifted one of the rings. It felt surprisingly warm in his fingers. Across from him, Lyra did the same. For a brief second neither of them moved. The trading hall had grown completely silent now. Hundreds of strangers watched from the surrounding balconies and walkways. Ethan looked at the ring in his hand, then at Lyra's calm violet eyes. A strange thought crossed his mind at that moment. Maybe the universe had not trapped him here. Maybe it had simply introduced him to someone else who had also been standing at a crossroads. The official's voice broke the silence. Do you accept this union freely? Ethan answered first. Yes. Lyra's voice followed, steady and clear. Yes. The official nodded once. Then place the rings and the bond is sealed. The rings hovered between them for a quiet second, glowing softly like 2 small moons caught in the artificial gravity of the station. Ethan Walker felt the warmth of the metal band resting in his palm and realized his hands were steadier now than they had been a few minutes ago. Maybe it was because the decision had already been made. Or maybe it was because Lyra Vesh was standing directly in front of him, calm and composed, her pale violet eyes meeting his without hesitation. Around them the trading hall remained silent, the crowd watching from balconies and walkways that stretched nearly 50 feet above the ceremonial floor. Even the cargo drones had paused along their rails as if the station itself had decided this moment deserved attention. Ethan lifted the ring slowly. Well, he said quietly, just loud enough for Lyra to hear. This is definitely the fastest engagement in human history. Lyra studied him for a brief moment before replying in the same calm tone she had used since the beginning. Efficiency appears to be a recurring theme today. Ethan let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Then he gently took her hand. Her skin felt cooler than his, smooth and faintly luminous under the pillar lights. The ring slid easily onto her finger and the moment it settled into place the band responded with a soft pulse of light, adjusting itself to fit her anatomy perfectly. A faint ripple of glowing symbols ran up the nearby ceremonial pillars, as if the station's ancient systems had acknowledged the act. Ethan released her hand slowly. For a brief second their fingers remained close, separated by less than an inch of space. Then Lyra lifted the second ring. Her movements were precise and careful, almost ceremonial even before the ritual demanded it. She reached for Ethan's hand, pausing only long enough for him to turn his palm upward. Her fingers closed gently around his. Ethan noticed that despite her composed expression, her grip was slightly tighter than expected. Not nervous exactly. Just aware of the moment. The ring slid onto his finger with the same soft glow. When it locked into place the metal warmed slightly against his skin, responding to his body temperature as the system confirmed the bond. The ceremonial official raised both hands and the glowing pillars brightened for a moment. The union is recognized, the official announced. 2 individuals. 2 houses. 1 agreement acknowledged across the Meridian Exchange. The crowd responded with a quiet wave of murmured voices, the sound echoing across the wide trading hall like distant wind moving through tall structures. Some spectators even offered polite applause, though it felt more like curiosity than celebration. Ethan glanced around the hall briefly before returning his attention to Lyra. So, he said with a half smile, does this mean I officially survived the ceremony? Lyra's silver hair shifted slightly as she tilted her head. Yes, she replied calmly. You survived. Good start. Karen Vesh approached from the edge of the platform, his long robes sweeping lightly across the polished floor. The merchant observed the 2 of them with clear satisfaction, as though he had just finalized a particularly profitable trade contract. Excellent, he said smoothly. The alliance is now secured. Ethan crossed his arms loosely. Glad we could help. Karen barely reacted to the dry tone. Instead he looked toward the upper balconies where several wealthy traders had been watching the ceremony closely. Our partners will be pleased, he said. Lyra remained still for a moment, her eyes following her father's gaze before returning to Ethan again. The quiet noise of the crowd continued around them, but something had shifted. The contract was complete. The ceremony was finished. The decision could not be undone. Ethan looked down at the glowing ring now resting on his finger and then back at the alien woman standing beside him. A few hours ago he had been a cargo pilot with a broken ship and a crushing debt. Now he was something else entirely. Lyra Vesh studied his expression carefully and asked in a soft voice, "Human Ethan Walker, are you regretting your decision already?" Ethan thought about that question for a moment before shaking his head slowly. No, he said honestly. Then he glanced toward the massive observation windows where the desert planet continued its slow rotation beneath the stars. I am just wondering what happens next. Lyra followed his gaze for a moment. When she spoke again her voice carried the faintest hint of something new. Not uncertainty. Not distance. Something closer to possibility. Now, she said quietly, our real lives begin. The ceremonial lights slowly dimmed as the official stepped away, and the crowd that had gathered around the platform began to dissolve back into the steady rhythm of the trading station. Conversations resumed. Cargo drones restarted their quiet routes along suspended rails. Within minutes the Meridian Exchange returned to its usual motion, as if an interspecies marriage in the middle of the trading hall was simply another line item in the daily schedule of the galaxy. Ethan Walker stood beside Lyra Vesh for a moment longer, watching the last few curious spectators drift away. The polished metal floor reflected the glow of the towering observation windows nearly 40 feet above them, where the desert planet below continued its slow silent rotation. For the first time since the contract appeared, the noise in Ethan's mind had settled. He lifted his hand slightly and examined the thin metal ring now resting on his finger. The band responded with a faint pulse of warm light, confirming its bond with his biology. Still feels strange, he admitted quietly. Lyra followed his gaze to the ring. The technology synchronizes with your nervous system, she explained. It recognizes you as part of our household now. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds a lot more official than just getting married. Before she could answer, the calm voice of Karen Vesh returned from behind them. It is more official. Ethan turned to see the merchant approaching again, his long robes flowing across the floor with the same composed confidence he carried earlier. Two tall assistants walked several steps behind him, each holding small data tablets that glowed with fresh transaction reports. Karen stopped in front of the newly married pair and examined them briefly, as if verifying that the final piece of a complex agreement had been properly installed. The union has already been transmitted to our trade partners, he said. News travels quickly when profit is involved. Ethan folded his arms loosely. I am starting to notice that. Lyra remained quiet beside him, her silver hair catching the light from the observation windows. Karen turned his attention toward her. You will depart within the hour, he said. Our vessel is prepared. Ethan blinked. Depart? The merchant nodded calmly. Your new residence awaits aboard the Vesh trading cruiser. It currently orbits 300 miles above this station. Ethan let out a small breath and glanced back toward the hall they had just crossed. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. A few hours ago I had a cargo ship and a bad day. Now I have a wife and I am moving on to a giant alien cruiser. Karen gave a small nod. An accurate summary. Ethan shook his head with quiet disbelief. My life back on Earth was never this efficient. Lyra turned slightly toward him, studying his reaction again with those steady violet eyes. Are you uncomfortable with the change? She asked softly. Ethan thought about that for a moment. The station lights glowed overhead. Cargo transports drifted slowly past the distant windows. Somewhere far below, the desert planet continued its endless rotation. Finally he gave a small shrug. Honestly, he said, I have spent most of my adult life flying from one unknown place to another. This might be the first time the universe actually told me where to go. Lyra considered that answer carefully. The faint glow from the ceremonial pillars had nearly faded now, leaving only the wide trading hall and the quiet stars beyond the windows. Karen gestured toward the exit corridor leading to the docking platforms. Come, he said calmly. Your ship is waiting. Ethan glanced at Lyra once more. She met his gaze without hesitation, then stepped forward beside him. Together they walked toward the docking corridor that would lead them out of the station and into whatever future waited among the stars. The docking corridor stretched ahead for nearly 200 yards, a long tunnel of transparent alloy that revealed the endless black of space on both sides. Ethan Walker walked beside Lyra Vesh in silence, their footsteps echoing softly across the smooth floor panels while distant docking lights blinked like quiet stars guiding incoming ships. Far ahead, a massive vessel waited in orbit outside the station, its hull reflecting pale sunlight from the distant system star. Even from this distance Ethan could tell the cruiser was enormous, easily half a mile long with layered decks and elegant curved structures that made it look less like a warship and more like a floating city designed by someone who appreciated symmetry and wealth. That is your family ship? Ethan asked as they continued forward. Lyra followed his gaze toward the cruiser suspended beyond the docking frame. Yes, she replied calmly. The Vesh Horizon. It has served my family for 3 generations. Ethan let out a quiet whistle. 3 generations built that. 3 generations expanded it. They reached the final airlock chamber where a smaller transport shuttle waited, its boarding ramp already extended. The vessel was sleek and quiet, painted in silver alloy with the same subtle glowing patterns Ethan had noticed on the ceremonial rings earlier. A pair of station technicians stepped aside respectfully as Lyra approached. Karen Vesh stopped near the entrance and turned to face them one last time before departure. The merchant studied Ethan carefully, his sharp eyes reflecting the docking lights overhead. Human Ethan Walker, he said in his composed voice. You should understand that this arrangement carries responsibility beyond debt repayment. Ethan nodded slowly. I figured as much. Karen gestured toward the cruiser outside the station. My trading network spans 32 systems. My daughter will inherit command of it one day. That means you will be seen by many cultures, many governments, and many species who have never met a human before. Ethan crossed his arms loosely, thinking about that. So I represent Earth now. Karen tilted his head slightly. In a manner of speaking. For a moment Ethan simply looked out the window again at the massive cruiser floating beyond the station frame. Then he gave a quiet half-smile. Well, that is definitely more pressure than my old cargo routes. Lyra stepped forward beside him, her silver hair shifting gently as the airlock systems adjusted pressure levels. You are not alone in this responsibility, she said softly. Ethan glanced at her. She held his gaze steadily, her expression calm but sincere. Our cultures will learn about each other through us, she continued. That is the true purpose of alliances like this. Ethan considered her words. Back on Earth he had spent years flying shipments between quiet colonies and remote stations, rarely thinking about how humans looked to the rest of the galaxy. Now the situation had changed in a way he had never imagined. Karen gave a small approving nod, as though satisfied with the direction of the conversation. Then our departure should not be delayed. The merchant turned and walked toward the shuttle ramp, his assistants following immediately behind him. Lyra gestured toward the entrance. After you, she said. Ethan stepped onto the ramp and into the shuttle interior, noticing how quiet the craft felt compared to the busy trading hall they had left behind. Soft lights glowed along the curved walls, and the wide cockpit window revealed the enormous cruiser waiting patiently in orbit above them. Lyra stepped inside a moment later and the ramp closed smoothly behind her. The engines activated with a gentle vibration under the floor. Through the forward window Ethan watched the station slowly drift away as the shuttle began its short flight toward the Vesh horizon. The stars outside seemed brighter now, stretching endlessly across the black. Ethan looked down at the glowing ring on his finger once more and then toward the alien woman seated beside him. His old life had ended somewhere back in that trading hall. Whatever waited ahead was something entirely new, and for the first time since the strange agreement began, he felt a quiet sense of curiosity instead of uncertainty. The shuttle drifted smoothly toward the Vesh horizon, and as the distance closed Ethan Walker began to understand just how enormous the vessel truly was. What had looked like a sleek cruiser from afar now unfolded into layered structures nearly half a mile long, with terraces of observation decks, long illuminated corridors running along the hull, and docking bays wide enough to hold entire cargo fleets. The shuttle slid into one of those bays with calm precision, passing through a glowing magnetic field before settling gently onto the landing platform. The moment the engine's power down the ramp unfolded, revealing a quiet hangar bathed in warm white light. Ethan stepped out beside Lyra Vesh and paused for a moment, taking in the scale of the place. The ceiling rose at least 80 feet above them. Cargo lifts moved silently along the walls, and several crew members walked across the polished floor with calm, practiced efficiency. None of them stared at Ethan. None of them reacted with surprise. They simply nodded respectfully toward Lyra as she passed, acknowledging her presence with the quiet discipline of people who understood their roles. Ethan leaned slightly toward her as they walked forward. "Either your crew is extremely professional," he said quietly, "or you warned them ahead of time that a confused human might show up." Lyra allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear. "Both are correct." They continued through the hangar and into a wide internal corridor that stretched nearly 300 feet toward the heart of the cruiser. Soft lighting glowed along the curved walls, and wide observation windows revealed the star field drifting slowly outside as the ship maintained its steady orbit above the desert world. Karen Vesh stopped at the entrance of a large chamber ahead and turned toward them one final time. "My responsibilities will keep me occupied for several hours," he said calmly. "The alliance we created today has already drawn the attention of several trading councils." Ethan gave a small nod. "I figured news like that spreads fast." Karen looked toward Lyra. "Until those matters are concluded, the cruiser is yours to guide." Lyra inclined her head slightly. "Understood." The merchant then looked back at Ethan for a brief moment. His expression carried the same calculating calm he had shown since the beginning, but now there was something else beneath it. A small measure of approval. "Human Ethan Walker," he said. "You entered this arrangement with honesty. That quality is rare in any species." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I did not have many other options." "Even so," Karen replied. "You chose cooperation rather than resentment. That will matter in the years ahead." With that final statement the merchant turned and disappeared into another corridor, leaving the two of them standing quietly in the wide central chamber of the cruiser. For a moment neither of them spoke. The ship hummed softly around them, the steady rhythm of a vessel built for long journeys across empty space. Ethan finally exhaled slowly and looked around the enormous room. "So this is home now," he said. Lyra stepped closer to the observation window where the distant stars shone like scattered silver dust. "For now," she replied gently. Ethan walked over and stood beside her, resting his hands lightly against the cool glass. Far below, the trading station had become a tiny point of light orbiting the desert planet. His old life was somewhere back there among the cargo routes and quiet docking bays. Lyra turned slightly toward him. "Do humans fear the unknown?" she asked softly. Ethan thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. Then he looked out at the endless stars stretching across the galaxy. "But we are also very good at walking into it anyway." Lyra followed his gaze into the vast darkness beyond the window. For a long moment neither of them moved, standing together on the deck of a ship that would carry them